When two robbers target a small shop, they have no idea that the seemingly ordinary dog inside is a retired K-9 officer. And if you like the story, remember to subscribe to the channel and activate the notification bell. What happens next is a shocking reminder of just how far loyalty and training can go. Write in the comments where you're watching this video from. The small, quiet neighborhood was the kind of place where people knew each other's names. The streets were lined with trees that had just begun to lose their leaves, the air crisp with the hint of fall. On a corner near the park stood a modest little shop, Maria's Antiques, a family-owned store that had been in business for over 20 years. Inside, the air always smelled of wood, metal, and the faint scent of old paper, an inviting aroma that lingered in the shop's cozy corners. The shelves were filled with relics from the past, tarnished silverware, delicate porcelain figurines, vintage clocks, and forgotten photographs. Each item seemed to have a story to tell, if only someone would listen. Maria, the owner, was a petite woman in her early 40s, with deep brown eyes that always seemed to gleam with a mix of warmth and curiosity. Her dark hair was pulled back in a ponytail, and she wore a soft smile as she dusted the shelves, occasionally pausing to rearrange things just so. She loved her store. It was her passion, her life, and she treated each customer who walked through the door with the same care and attention she gave her beloved antiques. It wasn't a glamorous business, but it didn't matter to Maria. This little shop was her sanctuary, the place where she could immerse herself in the stories of the past and escape the noise of the world outside. And then there was Rex, Maria's dog. A retired German Shepherd, once a certified K-9 officer with the local police force. The world knew him as a trained protector, a loyal partner to law enforcement officers, a dog who had once been on the front lines of crime scenes, sniffing out drugs and criminals with precision. Now, he was just Maria's companion. Though he had hung up his badge and collar years ago, Rex still carried the poise and demeanor of a trained officer. His posture was always alert, his movements measured. He spent most of his days lying by the door, watching over the shop with a quiet vigilance. The regular customers adored him, always stopping to pet him as they walked past. And Rex, though older and slower than he used to be, would always wag his tail in greeting, his eyes softening when he recognized a familiar face. Today was like any other. The sun hung high in the sky, casting a golden glow through the shop's windows. The soft hum of a passing car was the only noise outside, the rest of the world seemingly lost in its own rhythm. Maria hummed to herself as she worked, tidying up the counter and sorting through boxes of new items. Every now and then, she glanced at Rex, who was lying by the door, his head resting on his paws. He looked relaxed, almost peaceful. But Maria, who had spent enough time with him to know the smallest shifts in his behavior, couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. It wasn't anything overt. Just a feeling, a strange quietness that seemed to hang in the air. Rex had been more alert than usual, his ears twitching occasionally as if he heard something just beyond the range of human ears. Maria couldn't pinpoint it. The shop was as calm as ever, the only visitors being a few regulars who popped in for their weekly chats. But even as she smiled and greeted them, she couldn't ignore the knot that was beginning to form in her stomach. Rex didn't seem scared, just watchful. His eyes flickered occasionally to the window, scanning the street outside. Maria noticed him stiffen once or twice as a car rolled by or a person walked past, but he didn't bark, didn't growl. He was simply waiting. Maria went back to her work, pushing the unease aside. She had no reason to be worried. It was just one of those days when everything felt a little out of place for no particular reason. She had been feeling it for weeks now, an undercurrent of tension that she couldn't explain. Perhaps it was just the changing season, the unpredictability of life. But even as she tried to brush it off, she couldn't shake the feeling that something was about to happen. Something was coming, and she wasn't sure if she was ready for it. Her thoughts were interrupted by the sound of the doorbell jingling as it swung open. Maria glanced up, smiling, expecting to see a friendly face. But when she saw the two men standing in the doorway, her smile faltered. The first man was tall, his face obscured by a mask, and his body was tense, his hands fidgeting with something in his pocket. His partner, a shorter, stockier figure, kept his head down, his eyes darting nervously around the room. Neither of them seemed familiar. Maria's smile dropped completely, replaced by a sense of unease that surged through her chest. She had no reason to suspect anything at first. People walked in all the time, but there was something in their posture, in the way they carried themselves, that made the hair on the back of her neck stand up. "Good afternoon," Maria said, her voice calm but cautious. "Can I help you with something?" The taller man stepped forward, and without a word, he pulled a gun from his pocket, pointing it directly at Maria's chest. The sight of the weapon made her blood run cold. Her heart raced, and her breath caught in her throat. She instinctively took a step back, her mind scrambling to process what was happening. "We're not here for trouble," the man said, his voice gruff and steady. "Just give us the money, and no one gets hurt." Maria's thoughts were a blur. Her gaze flickered to Rex, who was still lying near the door, but something had changed. Rex was now sitting upright, his body tense, his eyes fixed on the two intruders. He wasn't moving, but Maria could feel the shift in his energy. His protective instincts were kicking in. He had seen this before, in his past life as a K-9, but this was different. This was personal. And as much as she wanted to believe everything would be okay, she couldn't shake the fear creeping up her spine. The second man moved closer to the counter, his hand trembling as he pointed at the cash register. "Open it," he demanded. "Now." Maria's hands shook as she reached for the register, but her mind was racing. What should she do? She could feel Rex's gaze on her, steady and unwavering. He wasn't about to let anything happen to her. But she couldn't just act rashly. She had to think. She had to stay calm. As she fumbled with the keys to the register, she heard a soft growl, low and deep, vibrating from Rex's throat. Her heart skipped a beat, and she froze. The sound wasn't loud, but it was unmistakable. Rex had recognized the threat. He was ready to protect her, no matter what. The taller robber's eyes narrowed as he glanced at the dog. "What's the matter with your mutt?" he sneered, clearly unaware of the dog's past. He waved the gun in Rex's direction, but Rex didn't flinch. He just kept his eyes locked on the man, his body stiff with tension. Maria took a breath, trying to steady her racing pulse. She wasn't sure what was happening, but she could feel it in her bones. Something was about to unfold. She only hoped that Rex would be ready for whatever came next. The robber's voice broke through her thoughts. "Hurry up," he barked, his finger tightening on the trigger. But Rex wasn't waiting for any more signals. He wasn't just Maria's dog. He was a trained K-9, and when the moment came, he would act without hesitation. Maria didn't know what would happen next, but one thing was certain, she wasn't alone. Rex was by her side. And when it came to protecting those he loved, nothing could stop him. The scene was set. The quiet neighborhood had always been a place of calm, a place where time seemed to slow, and people's worries were few. The little shop Maria ran was a sanctuary for the locals, offering everything from handmade goods to freshly brewed coffee. It wasn't a flashy place, but it was warm, welcoming, and filled with a certain charm that had made it a beloved part of the community. The constant hum of life outside was usually just a backdrop to the mundane and peaceful moments inside. But that morning, things felt different. Maria couldn't place it. It wasn't obvious at first, just a subtle shift in the air. She had been sweeping the floor, lost in the rhythm of the task, when a strange prickling sensation crawled up her spine. She paused, the broom still in her hand, and glanced around the room. The usual customers had come and gone for their morning coffee and treats, and the shop was quieter now, with only the soft ticking of the clock and the distant hum of traffic filling the silence. She turned her attention to Rex. He was lying near the counter, his eyes half closed, his body sprawled out in a relaxed pose. But even as she watched him, she noticed something. His ears were perked up, more than usual. His nose twitched, and his eyes, though half-lidded, followed the movement outside the window as if he could sense something before she could. Rex had been her partner for years, first as a K-9 officer and then as her loyal companion when he retired. His senses were sharper than most, and his instincts had never failed him before. She had long since learned to trust him. In fact, in the years since his retirement, they had both settled into a kind of routine. Maria didn't need to worry about him constantly. But something in the way he was acting now unsettled her. There was a stillness in the air, a quiet tension that made her hands tremble slightly as she set the broom aside. Rex's gaze didn't move from the window, though his body was tense, poised as if ready to spring into action. Maria frowned, walking over to him, crouching down to his level. She scratched behind his ears, something that usually calmed him. His muscles tensed beneath her touch, and for the first time, she felt a chill creep up her own spine. It was as though he was holding his breath, waiting for something to happen. "Hey, boy, what's going on?" she murmured softly, as if speaking to a child, though she knew that her voice was no match for whatever had his attention. Rex responded with a low growl, a sound she hadn't heard in months. It wasn't the playful growl he would give when they were out for walks or when a stranger entered the store. No, this was deep, guttural, filled with a tension that made the hairs on the back of Maria's neck stand up. She stood up, glancing again out the window. Nothing. The street was empty except for the usual cars passing by, and the people who typically frequented the shop were nowhere to be seen. Yet Rex was still on edge. For a moment, Maria thought about dismissing it, telling herself that Rex was just getting old. Maybe he was imagining things. But the memory of his past work, his instincts, and his sense of duty stopped her. Rex had served in the K-9 unit for years, finding drugs, tracking criminals, and bringing down dangerous people with a precision that was nothing short of remarkable. He wasn't just any dog. He was trained to notice things, to sense danger before anyone else did. Maria hesitated, a sense of unease settling deep within her stomach. She wasn't one to believe in coincidence, and Rex's strange behavior was too much for her to ignore. She glanced at the door, the bell hanging above it, the faint smell of coffee and baked goods lingering in the air. Nothing seemed out of place, and yet something felt wrong. She glanced back at Rex. His gaze was fixed, unmoving, his body stiff. And if you like the story, remember to subscribe to the channel and activate the notification bell. Maria's heart began to race. She instinctively reached for her phone, her fingers trembling as she pulled it from her pocket. Her first thought was to call the police, just in case. But before she could dial the number, she heard a noise. The faint sound of footsteps outside, the quick shuffle of feet against pavement. The hairs on her arms stood up, and she froze. Rex's growl deepened, his body coiling as though he were preparing to spring into action. Maria's breath caught in her throat. For a moment, it seemed as though time slowed. The sound of footsteps grew louder, approaching the door. Her heart pounded against her ribs, and her instincts screamed for her to take action. But she couldn't move. The doorbell chimed suddenly, and in an instant, the quiet, peaceful shop was invaded by the harsh presence of two masked men. They stormed in without hesitation, their eyes scanning the room, their faces hidden behind dark balaclavas. One of them wielded a gun, pointing it directly at Maria. His voice was cold, commanding. "Open the register." "Now," he demanded, his voice muffled by the mask. Maria's body stiffened as she stood frozen in place, her hand still clutched around her phone. The seconds felt like hours as her mind scrambled to catch up. Rex, however, was already on the move. His growl had turned into a full-throated snarl, his body tight with readiness. Maria's heart pounded as she realized what was happening. The robbers hadn't noticed Rex yet, their focus solely on her. "Do it!" "Open the register," the man with the gun shouted again, advancing toward her. Maria's fingers fumbled over the register, but her eyes were locked on Rex. His posture was rigid, his muscles taut with the tension of a dog on the edge of something. She didn't know what to do. Every instinct told her to comply, to give the men what they wanted and avoid confrontation. But she couldn't help but feel the growing sense of dread. Something was about to happen, something she couldn't control. Now, the robber barked. Maria opened the register and began pulling out the cash, her hands shaking. She tried to keep her voice steady, but her breath was coming faster, more shallow. She could feel Rex's presence beside her, his body still tight with anticipation. He was ready to defend her, to do whatever it took. But there was no way to know if it would be enough. The second robber, who had been pacing near the door, suddenly turned and looked down at Rex, his eyes narrowing. He sneered beneath the mask, the expression barely visible. "What's this, huh? Some stupid dog? Get him out of here," he sneered, taking a step closer. Maria's heart skipped a beat. She couldn't let them hurt him. Rex wasn't just a dog, he was a trained K-9, and despite the years of retirement, he still had instincts that were far sharper than these men could comprehend. The robber reached down, grabbing a stick from the counter and waving it in Rex's direction, taunting him. The movement was sudden, aggressive. Rex's growl escalated into a deep, menacing bark, his teeth flashing in a way that made the robber pause. For a brief moment, the room was filled with nothing but the sound of Rex's low, rumbling growls and the robber's heavy breaths. The air was thick with tension that Maria's mind raced. She had to act. Rex wasn't just an ordinary dog. He was trained to protect, to serve, and to respond to threats. The men had no idea what they were dealing with. She just hoped it wasn't too late. Her breath caught in her throat as Rex moved faster than she could react. The robber who had taunted him took a step back in surprise, but Rex was already on him, moving with the speed and precision that only a trained K-9 could. The next moment was a blur of motion, a blur of teeth and speed that overwhelmed the robber before he could even raise his hand in defense. Maria's heart raced. The other robber shouted in alarm, his hand trembling as he pointed the gun at her. "Stay back, you stupid dog," he yelled. But it was too late. Rex was already on top of him, lunging with the grace and power of a trained officer. The man stumbled back, losing his footing as Rex's teeth found their mark. Maria's world seemed to slow as she watched the chaos unfold. Her mind screamed at her to stay down, to stay out of the way. But all she could do was watch in awe as Rex, her loyal companion, turned from a retired pet into the fierce protector he had once been. The robbers had underestimated the power of a bond between a woman and her dog. Rex wasn't just Maria's dog. He was her hero. And he wasn't going to let anything happen to her. The doorbell above the shop rang sharply as two men stepped inside, their heavy boots echoing on the wooden floors. Their faces were masked, their eyes hidden behind dark sunglasses. They were fast, calculating, and aggressive. The taller one, with a broad frame and a gruff demeanor, immediately brandished a gun, holding it low but in clear sight of the customers and Maria. His partner, shorter but equally imposing, scanned the room quickly before fixing his gaze on the counter, where Maria stood frozen for a split second, still clutching a cup of coffee that she'd just taken a sip from. Maria's heart leapt into her throat. Her mind raced, but her body refused to move. This was happening. It was happening now. She could feel the tension in the air, thick like smoke. For a moment, everything in the shop seemed to still, as if the universe itself was holding its breath. The robber's eyes darted over the room. Customers were backing away slowly, panic creeping into their faces. No one dared to make a sound, afraid that even a whisper could set the men off. The tall one spoke first, his voice cold and demanding. "Give us the money, lady. Now." Maria's fingers trembled around the coffee cup, her gaze momentarily flicking over to Rex. He was lying by the door, his usual calm expression gone, replaced with a hard stare, his ears perked. Maria felt a flash of comfort just looking at him. Rex had always been her quiet strength, her constant in a world full of uncertainties. He had never failed her, even on the toughest days when she could barely hold herself together. But this was different. There was a real danger in the air now, one that no amount of love or familiarity could shield her from. Still, Rex was by her side. Always. Maria steadied herself, trying to calm her racing thoughts. She couldn't let the panic swallow her. She had to stay composed, for Rex and for herself. The robber's gun shifted in his hand, pointing it at Maria now, the cold steel of it gleaming menacingly. He motioned with the weapon toward the register. "Open it." "I won't tell you again," he spat, his words sharp, each syllable dripping with contempt. The short man, standing by the door, turned and kept a lookout for anyone outside or anyone who might try to intervene. His hand hovered near his own weapon, ready to react at a moment's notice. His body was tense, constantly scanning the room like a predator watching its prey. Maria nodded slowly, her throat dry as dust. She set the coffee cup down, her hand stiff, trying to fight the shaking in her fingers. The weight of the gun was suffocating, its presence overwhelming. The cold metal glared at her, daring her to move wrong, daring her to make a mistake. She took a step toward the register, her eyes still locked on Rex. Her heart pounded in her chest as she approached the till, hands moving mechanically. She knew the numbers. She knew the process. It should have been simple. She could have been calm. But the feeling of the gun, the tension that crackled through the air, threatened to tear her apart. The short man at the door glanced over his shoulder, his eyes flicking from her to the register. He gave a curt nod to the other robber. "Hurry up, lady," he growled, impatience creeping into his voice. Maria's hand hovered over the drawer. But then something shifted. Rex's growl, low and menacing, rolled from deep within his chest. It wasn't loud or rushed, but it was enough to freeze everything. The two robbers paused, their attention snapping to the dog. The tall man's grip tightened on his gun, and his eyes narrowed. He wasn't worried about Maria anymore. He was focused on the dog, who was now standing, his body tense and his gaze never leaving the men. Maria held her breath. She knew exactly what was happening. Rex wasn't just a dog, he was a trained K-9. A former police officer, trained to protect and to subdue in the line of duty. His instincts kicked in immediately, and the robbery, which had felt like a simple transaction of fear and intimidation, now took on an entirely new layer of danger. The taller man sneered. "What's this? A guard dog?" He glanced at his partner. "Is this supposed to scare me?" But Rex wasn't scaring them. Rex was preparing. Preparing for a moment that had been ingrained in him for years, when instinct took over and he could act without hesitation. He had been trained to sense threats and to act swiftly and decisively. And in that moment, the air was thick with the feeling that Rex was about to unleash everything he had been trained to do. The short man shifted uncomfortably, his hand now on his gun, ready to react to anything that might escalate. But the tall man, clearly annoyed by the interruption, turned his attention back to Maria. "Get on with it," he yelled. "Now." Maria stood frozen, her eyes locked on Rex. She could see the muscles in his legs twitching, his body tensed like a coiled spring, ready to act. She knew he wouldn't hurt anyone unless it was absolutely necessary. Rex had always been the gentlest dog in the world with her, but when it came to threats, when it came to protecting her, there was no hesitation. And there was no fear. As the tall robber reached forward to shove Maria aside, that was the moment Rex chose. His body exploded into motion with terrifying speed. The air was thick with the sound of his paws pounding against the floor as he lunged, his teeth bared and his snarl filling the room. The tall robber screamed, stumbling back as Rex's powerful jaws closed around his arm, a forceful bite that brought him to his knees. The sound of the robber's cries filled the air, panic seizing his voice as he struggled to free himself, but Rex's grip only tightened. The dog's teeth dug deeper, his trained instincts driving him to subdue the attacker as swiftly and forcefully as possible. Rex was no longer a pet. He was the protector, the trained warrior who had seen too many similar situations to count. The shorter robber stood there, frozen for a split second, his eyes wide as he tried to process what was happening. Rex, with his jaws firmly gripped on the first robber's arm, kept his gaze locked on the second man. The dog's body was low, his muscles taut and ready. His movements were smooth, deliberate, calculated. He wasn't making a sound now, but the silence between them spoke volumes. Maria's heart was in her throat, her mind reeling, but there was a part of her that felt a strange sense of relief. Rex was taking control. He was doing what he was trained to do, and for a moment, the shop felt safer with him leading the charge. The short man took a step back, his face pale. "What the hell?" he stammered, raising his own weapon, but before he could react, Rex released his hold on the first robber and turned to face him, moving with a speed that left the man no time to process. The robber tried to aim the gun at Rex, but before the trigger could be pulled, the dog was on him. Rex's body collided with the robber's chest, sending him crashing backward. The gun skittered across the floor, forgotten. The man was disoriented, the shock of the sudden attack leaving him too stunned to react. Rex stood over him, his body poised and ready to spring again if needed. Maria watched in awe, her breath coming in shallow gasps. Rex had always been so gentle with her, so calm. But now, she saw him as the dog he had been trained to be, a true K-9, one who was capable of acting without hesitation, without fear. The sound of sirens grew closer. The robbers, utterly defeated and disarmed by the sheer force of Rex's presence, were now on the ground, incapacitated and awaiting the arrival of the police. Maria moved forward slowly, trembling with adrenaline. Rex looked up at her, his eyes softening as he recognized her approach. She knelt down next to him, her hands shaking as she reached out to touch his head, to reassure herself that he was okay. In that moment, Rex was no longer the trained officer. He was her dog. Her protector. Her hero. The sound of the police rushing in, the flashing lights outside, all faded into the background as Maria hugged Rex tightly. He had done more than just protect her. He had reminded her of something deeper, loyalty, courage, and a bond that could never be broken. The doorbell chimed as the two robbers burst into the shop, their heavy boots thudding against the old wooden floor. Maria flinched, startled by the sudden intrusion. She had been behind the counter, restocking some jars of homemade jam when the familiar sound echoed through the store, signaling the entry of a new customer. But when she looked up, her heart dropped into her stomach. Two masked men stood at the entrance, one holding a gun, the other with a bag in hand. Their eyes scanned the room quickly, assessing the situation. Maria froze. Her body went rigid, her breath shallow. The sound of Rex's deep growl rumbled in the back of the store, though it was barely audible over the men's loud commands. For a moment, everything stood still. The robbers moved toward her, their eyes never straying from her face. She could feel the terror creeping up her spine. "Give us the money," one of them barked, his voice low and threatening. "Now." Maria's pulse raced in her ears as she tried to steady her shaking hands. Her mind raced, looking for a way out, a way to protect herself. But her thoughts quickly turned to Rex. She glanced behind her, just a few feet away, where the large German shepherd lay in his usual spot, near the back door. His eyes were wide and alert now, his ears flicking back and forth. He hadn't made a move yet, but Maria could tell he was tense. She knew him better than anyone, and she knew that he wouldn't let this go unnoticed. The robber with the gun stepped closer to her, and she instinctively took a step back, bumping into the counter behind her. Her heart pounded in her chest. She could hear the breath of the second man, the one holding the bag, moving in and out faster than it should. The man with the gun waved it in front of her face, his finger tapping impatiently on the trigger. "Did you hear me?" he growled, his voice thick with anger. "Give us the money, or we'll make it worse for you." Maria's gaze flickered back to Rex, her breath caught in her throat. He hadn't moved an inch, but she could see the tension building in his muscles. The hairs along his back were standing on end, and his usual calm, composed demeanor had vanished. He wasn't just watching the robbers, he was analyzing them, waiting for them to make a move. "Please," Maria whispered, her voice trembling. "Just take whatever you want and go. There's no need for this." She spoke in the calmest tone she could muster, hoping her words would make them back down. She knew the last thing she needed was to make them more aggressive, but her mind was racing. How could she make it out of this alive? The robber with the gun wasn't interested in negotiating. His eyes hardened as he stepped closer. "I don't have time for this," he spat. "Hurry up." In that instant, Rex let out a low growl that vibrated through the room. The sound was deep and menacing, so unlike anything Maria had ever heard from him. His body was tense, his muscles coiled, and his eyes were locked on the man with the gun. It was clear that he had shifted into a state of readiness, his instincts taking over. The robber stopped dead in his tracks, glancing over at Rex, who now stood at the back door, his gaze never leaving him. There was something in Rex's eyes that the robber couldn't ignore. It wasn't just the dog size, it was the intensity. Rex's training, all those years spent as a K-9 officer, was evident in that single stare. The robber seemed to hesitate, as if a warning bell had gone off in his mind. But he quickly recovered, shaking off the unease. "Get the dog under control," he snapped at the second man, who had been standing by the counter, eyeing the money in the register. The second robber glanced over at Rex, clearly nervous, but didn't move toward the dog. He was more concerned with getting the cash. Maria could feel the panic rising in her chest, but she knew better than to show fear. Her voice was steady as she spoke again. "Just take the money and go. Please. Don't hurt anyone." But the robber with the gun wasn't listening. His eyes flickered from Maria to Rex, and a dangerous smile curled at the corners of his mouth. "Maybe we can make this interesting," he sneered. Before Maria could react, the robber lunged at her, grabbing her by the arm and slamming her against the counter. She gasped as the air was knocked out of her lungs. The gun was pressed against her side, cold and unyielding. She could feel the weight of it, the threat of it. Rex's growl grew louder, more insistent. The air seemed to vibrate with the intensity of it. Maria's heart stopped. She saw the robber's grip on her tighten as he twisted her arm. But before Maria could even take another breath, Rex moved. It was like a flash of lightning. The dog lunged from the back of the store, his speed almost impossible to track. The first robber had no time to react. Rex's teeth found his arm, sinking in with terrifying precision. The man screamed, the sound high and panicked, as Rex shook him violently. The force of the dog's attack sent the robber stumbling back, dropping the gun to the floor. Maria barely registered the movement before she found herself freed from the robber's grasp. She staggered backward, her breath ragged in her chest. She could feel her pulse hammering in her ears, but all of her attention was on Rex. Rex didn't stop. He was still locked onto the man's arm, holding him down with a strength that was only possible through years of training. The second robber, who had been frozen in shock, finally snapped out of it. He reached for his own gun, but it was too late. Rex was already moving toward him. The dog's jaws snapped shut on the second robber's leg, and he howled in pain, stumbling backward into the shelves. Rex didn't relent. He was relentless, trained for moments like this. The robber attempted to get up, but Rex was on him in an instant, pinning him to the floor with an iron grip. Maria stood there, frozen in disbelief, watching Rex take control of the situation. The shop that had always been her sanctuary was now a battleground, but she knew that Rex was the one who was in charge. He was the one who would keep them safe. The robbers were helpless against the dog's fury. Neither man had expected this kind of reaction. They had come in expecting an easy score, but they had underestimated the dog. They had no idea who they were dealing with. Finally, the robbers stopped moving, their bodies immobilized by Rex's powerful hold. They were breathing heavily, each of them writhing in pain, trying desperately to escape, but Rex wouldn't let them go. He stood over them, eyes focused and determined. Maria could hear the sound of sirens growing louder outside. The police were on their way, but Rex had already neutralized the threat. He had done his job, his duty, and more. He had protected her, just as he had done for so many years before. The weight of what had just happened crashed down on her. She looked at the men, still on the ground, their eyes wide with terror. Then her gaze shifted to Rex. The dog was panting heavily, but he stood tall, unshaken. He had saved her life once again. She slowly approached him, her hand shaking as she reached out to him. "Rex," she whispered, her voice filled with awe. The dog's eyes softened as he met her gaze. He was still alert, still watching, but there was a calm in him now. He had done what he was trained to do, And now, it was over. Maria knelt beside him, her heart swelling with gratitude and love. Rex had always been more than just a dog to her. He had been her partner, her protector, and today, he had proven that he was still the hero he had always been. Rex's instincts kicked in before his body could fully react. His ears perked as his eyes locked onto the two masked men who had just stormed into the shop. Time slowed down. He felt the tension in the air like a charged electrical current. He was no longer just Maria's companion, lounging by the door on a lazy afternoon. In that moment, he was a warrior, trained for this, trained to protect. The two men were loud and aggressive, barking orders at Maria. They were focused on her, their guns aimed at her trembling figure. Maria's face went pale, but there was something else in her eyes, too, something sharp, something that told Rex she wasn't ready to give up without a fight. But it wasn't just her fight. It was his, too. The taller of the two robbers, with the more menacing air, was shouting at Maria, demanding money from the register. The other, a smaller, more jittery man, kept his gun pointed at her while nervously scanning the room, as if expecting an army to appear at any moment. They were panicked, untrained in how to hold power in such a situation. Rex had seen this before, during his days as a K-9 on the force, when officers would face similar threats, expecting quick resolutions. He could almost smell the fear wafting from the robbers, and he knew it would make them sloppy. Maria's fingers gripped the counter, her body frozen in a mix of terror and disbelief. She hadn't expected this. The shop had always been a peaceful haven, and now here she was, facing two armed criminals. Her mind raced, her hands trembling at her sides, but she didn't dare move. The shop was hers, her life's work, and she was willing to protect it. But what could she do? She wasn't trained for this. Rex, on the other hand, was. It wasn't a conscious decision. Rex's mind didn't need to ask if he should act. His body had already decided for him, reacting instinctively to the danger. His muscles coiled like springs, his body tensed, but his movements remained calculated, controlled. He hadn't been trained just to react to threats, he had been taught to protect and neutralize without hesitation. Rex's eyes, sharp as a blade, flicked between the two robbers. He had already assessed their positions, their stances, their weapons. The taller one was focused solely on Maria. That was the key. Rex's ears flattened against his head, a signal to his body that he was about to strike. The moment the robber stepped closer to Maria, reaching for the register, Rex made his move. In a flash, Rex leaped from his position by the door, a blur of muscle and speed. The first robber, the taller one, never saw it coming. Rex's teeth sank into the man's arm with a sickening crack. The man screamed, his gun flying out of his grip as he fell back, crashing into the shelves of canned goods. Rex's jaws didn't release their grip. He held tight, shaking the man like a rag doll, his body weight keeping the robber on the floor. The second robber, stunned and utterly shocked by the ferocity of the attack, stood frozen for a moment, wide-eyed. Maria's heart raced in her chest as she watched. This wasn't the sweet, calm Rex she had known. This was the dog that had once commanded respect on the streets, the dog that had sniffed out danger and apprehended criminals with ease. Maria had always known Rex had it in him, but seeing it in action again, so fast, so fierce, took her breath away. The second robber hesitated, then turned and raised his gun toward Rex, his hands shaking. "Get off him, you damn dog," he shouted, but his voice was high-pitched, panic dripping from his words. Rex's eyes were fixed on him now, his gaze cold and unwavering. It wasn't fear Rex felt, but purpose. He wasn't going to let this man harm Maria. Rex growled, the sound deep and guttural, coming from somewhere deep in his chest. It was the growl of a dog who had been through the worst of it, who had seen the bloodshed, the violence, the danger. It was the growl of a dog who knew how to end a fight. The robber took a step back, his hand trembling around the gun. And if you like the story, remember to subscribe to the channel and activate the notification bell. He wasn't trained, not like Rex, and the fear was written all over his face. Rex knew it, too. There was a brief moment of silence, the air thick with tension as the robber made eye contact with Rex. The robber's finger twitched on the trigger, but Rex was already moving. With a speed that belied his age, Rex charged. He ducked low, charging straight at the second robber's legs. The man yelped, stumbling backward, but it was too late. Rex's jaws snapped shut on his arm, and the man screamed in pain. Rex didn't release. He tugged and twisted, pulling the robber off balance until he crashed to the ground, his gun clattering out of his hand. The shop fell into silence. Maria stood, frozen in shock, her mind struggling to catch up with the chaos unfolding around her. Her breath came in shallow gasps as she tried to process what had just happened. One robber lay motionless on the floor, his arm twisted in Rex's powerful grip, while the other was on his back, groaning in pain and unable to move. Rex stood over them, his body still tense, his eyes scanning the scene. The calm before the storm was gone now. In its place was a quiet, still power, a reminder of just how much Rex had been through, and how deeply he was connected to Maria. He was her protector, and nothing, no one, was going to harm her on his watch. Maria's hands shook as she slowly approached, the adrenaline still coursing through her veins. She reached out tentatively, touching Rex's fur, her fingers trembling as she petted him. Rex's eyes softened, but his muscles remained rigid, his body still ready to act if necessary. He looked at Maria, and for a moment, there was an unspoken understanding between them. He had done his job. She was safe. The robbers lay still on the floor, too scared to move, too broken to fight back. Maria, still in disbelief, looked at the two of them. The robbers had come in expecting an easy score. They had never imagined this, never imagined a retired K-9 would be standing in their way, ready to fight for her life. Rex stepped back, letting out a soft pant. His eyes never left the robbers, who were now curled into a ball, too afraid to move. Maria reached down, her hands trembling as she retrieved the phone from her pocket. She didn't trust her voice to do much more than tremble, but she managed to dial the police. She knew Rex had neutralized the threat, but she needed help, needed to get the authorities involved to ensure these men were taken off the streets. As she spoke to the dispatcher, Rex sat next to her, his head slightly tilted, his breathing steady. She felt a deep sense of gratitude and awe for him. The bond between them was more than just human and animal. It was a partnership, forged through years of shared experiences, of trust and training. It was a bond that no criminal could break. Maria took a deep breath, finally able to release the tension that had been holding her body captive. The robbers would never know just how close they had come to being subdued by someone who wasn't just a dog, he was a trained protector. Rex, despite his retirement, had never stopped being a K-9. The sirens outside finally grew louder as the police arrived. Rex stood by Maria's side, his ears perked, his body still alert. His job was done, but he wasn't leaving her just yet. Maria reached out, giving him one last gentle pat on the head. Rex was home. And he had done what he was trained to do. The robbers scrambled to their feet, shock and fear overtaking their senses. Neither of them had expected this, not in the slightest. The first robber, the one Rex had attacked, held his bleeding arm with his other hand, gritting his teeth in pain. He could barely stand, let alone fight. He had been thrown to the ground with such force that it felt like his bones had been rearranged. His breath came in ragged gasps as he struggled to regain control. His partner, the second robber, stood frozen in place, his gun still raised but shaking in his hand. The sound of Rex's growl still reverberated in his ears, sending a cold shiver down his spine. For a moment, there was only the sound of Rex's low, menacing growl, punctuated by the steady breathing of the robbers and Maria's own sharp, fearful breaths. The air in the shop felt thick, as if the weight of the situation was pressing down on all of them. The robbers were calculating their next move, but nothing seemed to make sense anymore. This wasn't a simple heist. They had planned for cash, maybe a few valuables, but they hadn't prepared for an attack by a trained, former K-9 officer. Maria stood frozen, her eyes wide as she watched the scene unfold before her. Her mind was a jumble of confusion, disbelief, and fear. Her shop, her sanctuary, was suddenly a battlefield. Her dog, Rex, her loyal companion, was acting with the instinct and precision of a professional. He was no longer just a dog who followed her around, lying by her feet or playing fetch in the yard. Rex was her protector, the one who had spent years serving beside law enforcement, defending and serving with courage that only a few could ever understand. And now, Rex was defending her, just as he had done countless times before, but never like this, never with so much at stake. The first robber, his hand clutching his bleeding arm, looked down at Rex with a mix of fear and anger. He had underestimated the dog, assuming he was just some harmless pet. But Rex was no mere pet. His muscles rippled under his fur, his eyes locked onto the robbers with an intensity that only someone trained to hunt and protect could understand. He wasn't just an animal acting on instinct. Rex was calculating, his every movement deliberate, planned to keep Maria safe. The second robber, still shaking, glanced at his partner, eyes wide with panic. He could see the blood dripping from the other's arm, a clear indication that Rex was no ordinary dog. His thoughts raced, but nothing came to him. Should they run? Should they try to fight back? Neither option felt right. Neither seemed like it would work. Rex stepped forward, his body lowering, muscles coiled and ready for another strike. The robbers both flinched, their eyes darting to the door. But they knew they couldn't make it out. Rex was too fast, too strong, and by now, Maria had backed herself into the corner, out of harm's way. There was nowhere to run. The robbers were trapped, and they both knew it. The silence in the room was deafening, the tension almost unbearable. Rex let out a sharp, warning bark, his eyes still locked on the robbers. The sound was a command, a final warning. The robbers looked back at Maria, and for the first time, they saw her differently. She was no longer just a shopkeeper, she was the woman who had a dog capable of terrifying precision and strength. And she wasn't alone. This was no longer just a robbery, it had become a standoff, one that neither of them had prepared for. The second robber, his fingers trembling on the gun, made a desperate decision. Without thinking, he raised the weapon toward Maria, his finger tightening on the trigger. In that split second, everything seemed to slow down. Maria's heart stopped, her breath caught in her chest, and then Rex was there. He moved faster than either of the robbers could comprehend. In one fluid motion, Rex lunged at the second robber, knocking him to the ground with such force that the man's head slammed against the floor. The gun flew from his hand, skidding across the room. Rex was on him in an instant, his teeth bared, a fierce snarl escaping his throat. The man screamed, hands raised to protect his face, but it was too late. Rex's grip on his arm was unrelenting, and the robber's body went slack with fear. Maria's heart pounded in her chest as she watched Rex restrain the second robber, his powerful jaws holding the man's arm firmly in place. Rex was calm now, his eyes focused on the threat in front of him, not even a hint of hesitation in his movements. He was in control. Rex was doing what he had been trained to do, protect and subdue, without mercy for those who threatened his charge. He wasn't angry, he wasn't emotional. He was simply fulfilling his duty. The first robber, now completely overwhelmed by the situation, staggered back, still clutching his injured arm. His eyes darted between his partner, now pinned to the floor, and the dog who had disarmed him in mere seconds. He realized with a sinking feeling that this wasn't going to end well for him. He stumbled backward, desperate to make a run for it, but Rex's eyes followed every movement. The dog didn't need to move, the mere presence of Rex's gaze was enough to make the man freeze. He knew better than to make any sudden moves. Maria slowly backed away, her hands trembling as she reached for her phone, her mind still reeling. It felt surreal, like some twisted nightmare she couldn't wake up from. But Rex wasn't dreaming. Rex was in his element, doing exactly what he had been trained to do. He was her protector, and in this moment, he was everything she needed. The sirens wailed in the distance, signaling the arrival of the police. Maria had dialed them the moment she realized what was happening, but it felt like an eternity had passed. Her hands were shaking, But she couldn't tear her eyes away from Rex, who stood over the second robber with a quiet authority that only a former K-9 officer could possess. The robber was completely subdued, his body still and unmoving, his expression one of pure terror. The first robber was still standing, but he didn't dare make a move. When the police finally arrived, they were met with the sight of two robbers on the ground, completely immobilized, subdued by a dog that had once been a law enforcement tool. The officers, clearly surprised, stepped carefully into the shop, weapons drawn but ready to relax their stance when they saw Rex standing calmly by Maria's side. Maria looked at Rex, her heart full of gratitude and something deeper, something she couldn't quite put into words. She knew Rex had saved her life, but it wasn't just that. Rex had been there, beside her, protecting her when no one else could. He had done his job with the skill and grace of a seasoned officer, and in doing so, he had reminded Maria just how much she owed him. He wasn't just a pet. He was family. The officers moved in, securing the robbers, but it was Rex who caught their attention. He stood tall, unscathed and strong, his gaze unwavering. Maria gently patted his head, her fingers trembling with emotion. She couldn't speak. There were no words for the gratitude she felt in that moment. Rex had done more than just protect her. He had proven that no matter how much time had passed, he would always be her hero. The sound of sirens grew louder with each passing second, cutting through the tension-filled air that had settled inside the shop. Maria stood frozen, her eyes wide in disbelief, heart still racing. She had never imagined that her quiet day at the store would turn into something like this. But as the robbers lay on the ground, subdued by Rex, her loyal German shepherd, Maria couldn't shake the overwhelming mix of emotions coursing through her: relief, awe, and an immense gratitude that seemed to rise within her chest. The two men who had barged into her shop moments ago were no longer the towering, threatening figures they had been. Now, they were trembling, lying sprawled out on the floor, disoriented and humiliated by the overwhelming force of a dog they had mistakenly underestimated. Rex, standing tall beside her, was panting heavily, his chest rising and falling with each breath. His eyes never left the robbers, watching their every move with the intense focus that had been a hallmark of his training. Even after everything, even after the danger had passed, he was ready. Rex was still alert, a guardian through and through. Maria slowly exhaled, realizing just how much time had passed in that brief, chaotic moment. The adrenaline was still coursing through her veins, her body trembling slightly. She looked at Rex, her loyal companion who had been by her side for years, both as a retired K-9 officer and as her friend. He had kept her safe, just as he had done countless times during his active service. But this time, it wasn't on the job. This time, he had protected her, as she had always hoped he would, even after retirement. She could hear the distant voices of the responding officers, their footsteps growing closer as they approached the shop. But in that moment, it felt like time had slowed, stretching out the few minutes into what seemed like an eternity. Maria reached down, her hands trembling as she petted Rex, her fingers running through the coarse fur of his neck. His body was still tense, his muscles coiled, but as soon as he felt the touch of her hand, his gaze softened, and his posture relaxed ever so slightly. Maria's heart swelled with emotion. This wasn't just a dog. He wasn't just a retired officer. He was the one who had kept her safe when no one else could. And if you like the story, remember to subscribe to the channel and activate the notification bell. He had acted without hesitation, without fear, because that was the nature of who he was, her protector. "Good boy, Rex," Maria whispered, her voice thick with emotion. "You saved me." Again. Rex turned his head to look up at her, his eyes meeting hers with a look that seemed to convey more than words ever could. It wasn't just the bond of a pet and its owner, it was the bond forged in the heat of dangerous moments, built over years of shared experiences. Maria felt her chest tighten, her eyes welling with tears, as she gently scratched behind his ears, the spot that always seemed to calm him. He leaned into the touch, his eyes fluttering closed in a rare moment of peace. After everything that had happened, he was still the same Rex, her loyal, fierce companion. The sound of approaching footsteps pulled Maria from her reverie, and she quickly wiped away the tears that had threatened to fall. She turned to see the first of the police officers step through the door. His eyes scanned the room quickly, taking in the scene, the two robbers on the floor, hands cuffed behind their backs, and Rex standing proudly by Maria's side. For a moment, the officer hesitated, his eyes widening as he took in the sight of the German Shepherd. He had been trained to recognize a K-9 when he saw one, and the sight of Rex brought back memories of his own interactions with these incredible dogs. But this wasn't just any K-9. This was Rex, the retired officer, the one who had served with distinction. Maria didn't need to explain. The officer could see it in Rex's stance and his unwavering focus that he was no ordinary dog. The officer glanced at her, then at the robbers, before stepping closer. "You're safe now," he said, his voice calm but filled with an edge of respect as he took in the scene. He didn't need to ask questions right away. He knew what had happened. Rex had done what Rex had always done, protected, with everything he had. Maria nodded slowly, her voice barely a whisper. "He's a retired K-9 officer. He used to work with the police before he retired." Her voice trailed off, the reality of the situation still sinking in. She had known that Rex was capable, had seen glimpses of his former self in the way he had always responded to her commands, to strangers, to situations where his protection was needed. But seeing him in action, seeing him spring into defense mode with no hesitation, had been a reminder of how much she had underestimated him. How much she had taken for granted. The officer crouched beside Rex, extending a hand to the dog with a look of deep respect. Rex, who had been on high alert just moments ago, relaxed almost immediately, his tail beginning to wag slowly as he sniffed the officer's hand. The officer smiled softly, recognizing the familiarity in the dog's movements. He had worked alongside many K-9s in the past, but few had made the impression that Rex had. The dog's eyes, full of purpose, told a story that words could never fully capture. Maria watched quietly, her hand resting on Rex's back, feeling his body tremble slightly as the adrenaline wore off. He was exhausted, but his spirit, his loyalty, remained intact. He had done his duty, just as he had been trained to do, and now he would rest. She felt a surge of gratitude well up inside her. She didn't know how to put into words just how much Rex meant to her. He had saved her life, and for that, she would be forever indebted. The officer looked up at Maria, a soft smile tugging at the corner of his lips. "You're lucky to have him. He's a hell of a dog." Maria nodded, her throat tight with emotion. "I know. I'm so lucky." In the distance, more officers arrived, their voices echoing as they surveyed the scene. But for now, all Maria could focus on was Rex, standing beside her, still on guard, still ready to protect. She stroked his fur one last time, her touch gentle, as if reassuring him that the danger had passed. Rex, ever the professional, didn't flinch. He was content now, knowing his job was done. He had kept her safe. As the officers took over, gathering evidence and preparing the robbers for transport, Maria stepped back, allowing them to do their work. But she stayed close to Rex, her hand resting on his side. They had been through a lot together, she and Rex, and today was just another chapter in their journey. She had seen what he was capable of when pushed to the limit, but she had also seen his unwavering loyalty to her, even in his retirement. It was the kind of loyalty that few humans could ever understand, but one that Maria felt deeply in her heart. Eventually, the officers led the robbers out of the shop, their hands cuffed behind their backs. The scene was quiet now, the chaos and tension replaced by the sound of distant voices and the occasional scrape of a pen on paper. Maria watched them leave, feeling the weight of the event settle over her. She turned to Rex, who had returned to his usual calm demeanor, though his eyes still held the sharpness of a K-9 ready for action. She leaned down and pressed a kiss to the top of his head, her voice full of gratitude. "Thank you, Rex. I don't know what I would have done without you." Rex, ever the humble protector, simply wagged his tail, as if to say, "It's what I do." And Maria knew. He had always done it. For years, he had protected, served, and loved. And now, in the quiet aftermath of this attack, she realized that no matter what happened next, Rex would always be her hero. Maria stood still, her heart racing, her breath shaky as the police cars pulled up outside the shop. The robbers had been apprehended, restrained by Rex, her faithful companion who had just saved her life. The officers moved quickly, taking the criminals into custody, but Maria barely noticed them. Her attention was focused entirely on the German shepherd standing beside her, his powerful frame still tense, but his eyes now soft and calm. Rex's breathing was steady, yet there was an underlying exhaustion in the way his muscles subtly relaxed after the adrenaline of the past few minutes. The flashing blue and red lights outside illuminated the small shop, casting an eerie glow through the windows. The sound of footsteps, voices, and radios crackling over the police officers' shoulders began to fill the air, but to Maria, it all felt distant. She couldn't tear her gaze away from Rex. The way he stood beside her, like a silent sentinel, still alert but also trusting that she was safe, spoke volumes about the bond they shared. They didn't need to speak. She understood him as much as he understood her. It wasn't just that Rex had reacted to the threat the way any dog might. It was that he had done it with the precision, the authority, and the intensity of the highly trained K-9 he had once been. He had responded without hesitation, without fear, and most importantly, without needing orders. He had protected her instinctively, as if all the years of partnership, all the hours spent together on patrol, had never truly ended. As he nuzzled his head gently against her hand now, it was as though he was reminding her that he would always be there, no matter how much time had passed since his retirement. Maria took a slow, steadying breath, her fingers trembling as she ran them through Rex's thick fur. She had known Rex before he was a certified K-9. He was just a young, playful pup when she adopted him all those years ago, full of energy and excitement. The first time she took him to the training facility, she had no idea how much he would change her life. She never imagined the bond they would form, how he would become more than just a dog, but a partner in the truest sense of the word. Over the years, they had been inseparable. She had always trusted him, but now, in the aftermath of the robbery, she saw him in a new light. The police officers had finished taking their statements, their questions fading into the background as Maria knelt to be at eye level with Rex. She could feel the weight of the moment, the quiet understanding that passed between them. This wasn't just about a robbery gone wrong. This was about trust. This was about loyalty that ran deeper than words. Rex had not only served as a protector during his time as a K-9, but even in his retirement, he had never stopped being one. She could still see it, the flash of recognition in the eyes of the robbers when they realized what they were up against. They had underestimated Rex, thinking him to be a simple pet. They had no idea that the dog in front of them had once been a member of a law enforcement team, trained to handle the most dangerous situations. They had no idea how deeply Rex had been embedded in the world of justice, how many lives he had touched and protected in the years before his retirement. But in that moment, when he had lunged at the first robber, they had learned the truth. "Good boy, Rex," Maria whispered, her voice breaking slightly. She couldn't help herself. She didn't just feel relief. She felt an overwhelming sense of gratitude. Rex had saved her, but more than that, he had shown her that even in retirement, he was never truly gone. She reached for his collar, her fingers brushing the old, worn leather that had once signified his K-9 status. Now, it was a symbol of the bond they shared, a bond that no amount of time could erase. Rex, for his part, seemed content to remain by her side. He wasn't concerned with the chaos of the situation anymore. The adrenaline that had surged through him earlier was dissipating, but there was something else now, something peaceful. He turned his head slightly, watching the police officers outside as they finished up their work, but his focus remained on Maria. She could see the weariness in his eyes, the way his body still held the slightest tension, a reminder of the physical toll his years of service had taken. But there was pride in his gaze too, a quiet pride that came with knowing he had done exactly what he was meant to do. As the last of the officers stepped outside to finish their reports, Maria gently stood and walked to the counter, her mind still processing the events. She hadn't been able to move when the robbers first entered, hadn't been able to react until Rex had. It was as if everything had slowed down in that moment. She had been frozen with fear, but Rex, he had been ready. She had trusted him, and he had come through, just as he always had. Her hands trembled slightly as she wiped down the counter, the normalcy of the action grounding her. She needed the routine. The chaos of the robbery still lingered in her mind like a fog, but it was starting to clear. She turned back to Rex, who had followed her over, standing nearby. His eyes were calm now, his body relaxed. But Maria could feel the weight of what had just happened. The rush of emotions was starting to settle within her, relief, gratitude, admiration. She had seen Rex in action before, but never like this. He had saved her life, and it had happened so quickly, so naturally, that it almost felt surreal. A soft laugh escaped her lips. "I guess you're not really retired, huh?" she said, more to herself than to Rex. He gave her a soft whine, his tail thumping the floor, as if in agreement. Maria smiled, her heart swelling with affection. Rex had never really retired, had he? Not in the way she thought. He had always been ready to protect, to serve. His instincts had never dulled, and in that moment, he had proven that he would always be her protector, no matter what. She knew that their lives would return to normal eventually. The police would finish their paperwork, the robbers would be taken into custody, and the shop would return to its peaceful routine. But she also knew that things would never be quite the same. She would never look at Rex the way she had before. He wasn't just her companion anymore. He was a hero. He had done what he was trained to do, what he had always done, but now there was a new layer to their relationship. A deeper understanding. She walked over to the door and opened it, letting the cool night air wash over her. The world outside was quiet, the only sounds coming from the distant hum of traffic and the occasional siren fading into the background. But inside, there was a different kind of silence, a silence of gratitude. Maria stood there for a moment, taking it all in. It had been a chaotic, terrifying few minutes, but now it was over. And in the stillness, she could feel the weight of Rex's presence beside her. He was no longer just a dog who had been by her side for so many years. He was something more. He was a living reminder of what it meant to be loyal, to be brave, and to never stop protecting the ones you love. "Come on, Rex," Maria said softly, stepping back inside and closing the door behind her. "Let's get you something to eat." Rex, as if understanding, followed her back into the shop, his tail wagging slightly as they settled into the quiet of the evening. Maria took a deep breath and let it out slowly, feeling the tension leave her body. The worst was behind them. And in the end, they had come through it together, just like always. It was a new chapter for both of them, one that Maria knew would be defined not just by the years they had spent together, but by the unwavering bond they had forged through fire, through training, through love, and through loyalty. Rex wasn't just her dog. He was her hero. And no amount of time could ever take that away from him. And if you like the story, remember to subscribe to the channel and activate the notification bell.